The roar of the Maybach engine was deafening as I gripped the steering wheel of my Panzer 38T, the Soviet border just kilometers ahead. Dawn was breaking on June 22, 1941, painting the horizon in hues of orange and blood red. Through the periscope, I could see the tension in the faces of my crew. Gunther, our loader, nervously checking his ammunition. Franz, the radio operator, listening intently for the final order. And Helmut, our gunner, cleaning his barrel with practiced precision. Any minute now, I muttered to myself, knowing what was coming. At 3:15 a.m., the order would come, and 3 million of us would become the spearhead of the largest invasion in human history. It would be Hitler's biggest mistake, though none of us knew it yet. I am Otto Carius, 22 years old, a lieutenant in the German Wehrmacht, commanding a Panzer 38T light tank as part of the 6th Panzer Division's 65th Panzer Regiment. Today marks the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, our invasion of the Soviet Union. We've been training for months, building up our strength along the border. The tension is palpable. Everyone knows this is different from our previous campaigns in Poland and France. This is ideological, existential. Our commanders have told us we're fighting Judeo-Bolshevik subhumans, but all I see are farmers and soldiers who look much like us. Our division is part of Army Group Center, under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock. We're tasked with driving straight toward Moscow, the heart of the Soviet Union. The plan is audacious: reach the capital before winter sets in, destroy the Red Army in a series of encirclements, and force a surrender. It's a gamble, but we've been winning so far, why not this time? The final order crackles through the radio. Fall Rot begin at 3:15 or. Operation Red beginning at 3:15 a.m. Instantly, the artillery along the entire front erupts. The sky lights up with the flashes of thousands of guns. Start the engine, I yell to our driver Karl. The Maybach roars to life, and we lurch forward, joining the tidal wave of steel that's about to crash into the Soviet Union. The first hours of the invasion were a blur of motion and noise. Our Panzer 38T was a Czech-designed tank that Germany had acquired after annexing Czechoslovakia. It wasn't the most powerful tank. Its 37mm gun was barely adequate against Soviet armor, but it was reliable and maneuverable. We moved quickly across the border, Soviet positions appearing surprised and disorganized. Red Army soldiers were caught napping, their barracks still dark as we rolled past. "Look at that," Gunther exclaimed, pointing at a Soviet airfield that was already being strafed by our Luftwaffe Stukas. "They didn't even get their planes in the air. They weren't expecting us," Franz replied grimly. "Not like this. We were part of the initial wave that was supposed to punch through the Soviet border defenses and create chaos in their rear areas." The speed of our advance was crucial. Our commanders believed that if we could move fast enough, we could prevent the Red Army from organizing a coherent defense. By noon, we had crossed the Bug River and were advancing toward the town of Brest-Litovsk. The resistance was light, mostly consisting of border guards who quickly surrendered or fled. We captured entire units without firing a shot, their commanders looking bewildered at the sudden onslaught. That evening, we set up a defensive position near a small village. The villagers watched us with fear in their eyes, their expressions a mixture of terror and confusion. A local translator who had attached himself to our unit explained that they had been told we were coming as liberators from Stalin's tyranny, but the speed and ferocity of our advance had clearly caught them off guard. As darkness fell, our regiment commander, Major Ritter von Roman, gathered us for a briefing. "The initial reports are encouraging," he announced. "We've penetrated deep into Soviet territory with minimal losses. The enemy appears surprised and unprepared. However, we must expect stiffening resistance as we move further east. The Soviets will not simply roll over." He pointed to a map. "Our division is to continue pushing eastward, toward Minsk. We need to link up with other units and encircle the Soviet forces in the area. Intelligence indicates significant Red Army concentrations in that region." The mood was cautiously optimistic. We had expected heavy fighting, but so far, it had been almost too easy. The coming days would test whether this optimism was justified. The next 3 days were a relentless advance. We moved quickly, covering territory at a pace that would have been impossible in the muddy conditions of the previous year's campaign in France. The roads were good, the weather cooperative, and Soviet resistance remained sporadic and disorganized. On June 25, we encountered our first serious opposition near the town of Slonim. Soviet T-26 tanks emerged from a forest and engaged us. Our 37mm guns were largely ineffective against their thicker frontal armor, but we managed to flank them and hit their weaker sides and rear. The battle was chaotic, with tanks maneuvering in the fields, firing at each other at close range. "Target that T-26!" I yelled, pointing through my periscope. Helmet worked quickly, his hands moving with practiced precision. The 37mm shell struck the Soviet tank side, sending up a shower of sparks and metal. The tank stopped smoking, its crew likely killed or wounded. We destroyed 3 Soviet tanks before they retreated, leaving behind burning wrecks. Our own losses were minimal. One of our Panzer 38TS was damaged, but could be repaired. The crew was shaken but unharmed. After the battle, we searched the abandoned Soviet positions. The soldiers had left behind equipment, personal effects, and propaganda posters depicting heroic Red Army soldiers crushing fascist invaders. It was a stark contrast to our own situation. We were advancing quickly, confident in our superiority, while the Soviets seemed to be in disarray. That night, as we set up camp in a field near Slonim, I reflected on what we had seen so far. The Soviet soldiers we had encountered were poorly equipped and led. Their tanks, though more numerous than ours, were technically inferior and often crewed by men who seemed to lack training. If this was the best the Red Army could offer, our chances of reaching Moscow before winter looked promising. But I couldn't shake a nagging doubt. The scale of the Soviet Union was immense, and we had only seen a small part of it. What if they had more, better hidden reserves? What if their leadership was simply waiting for us to advance deeper before unleashing their full strength? These questions haunted me as I tried to sleep in the cramped confines of my tank. By early July, our division had reached Minsk and was participating in the encirclement of the Soviet forces in the city. The scale of the operation was breathtaking. Our panzers had advanced hundreds of kilometers in just 2 weeks, and now we were part of a massive pincer movement that was trapping entire Soviet armies. On July 9th, we were positioned on the outskirts of Minsk, watching as German infantry closed the encirclement. From our elevated position, we could see the vast pocket of Soviet soldiers trapped in the city. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and cordite as artillery shells exploded in the distance. "Look at that," Franz said, pointing at the horizon. "It's like a sea of men." He wasn't exaggerating. The Soviet forces trapped in Minsk numbered over 300,000 men, a staggering number that underscored the scale of our advance. For days, these men had been bombarded and cut off from supply, and now they were beginning to surrender in large numbers. Our role was to help contain the pocket and prevent any breakout attempts. We spent most of our days patrolling the perimeter, watching as long columns of Soviet prisoners marched westward under guard. The sight was both impressive and sobering. These were men who had been defending their homeland, and now they were being led away as captives. One afternoon, as we were taking a break near a farmhouse, a group of Soviet prisoners was being marched past. They looked exhausted and demoralized, their uniforms in tatters, their faces covered in dirt and grime. One of them, a young soldier who couldn't have been more than 18, caught my eye. He looked at me with an expression that was hard to read, part fear, part defiance, part resignation. I found myself wondering what these men thought of us. Were they truly Judeo-Bolshevik subhumans, as our propaganda portrayed them, or were they simply ordinary people caught in a war they didn't want? The question troubled me, but I pushed it aside. We were soldiers, and our job was to follow orders and win the war. That evening, our regiment commander visited us. "Excellent work," he told us. "The encirclement of Minsk is nearly complete." Intelligence reports indicate that we've captured over 300,000 Soviet prisoners and destroyed thousands of tanks and artillery pieces. This is a decisive victory. The mood in our unit was jubilant. We were winning, and winning big. The war in the East seemed to be going according to plan. But as I looked at the map and saw the distance we still had to cover to reach Moscow, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. We had advanced so quickly, but the road ahead was still long, and we were only in July. By mid-July, we were advancing again, this time toward Smolensk, a key city on the road to Moscow. The landscape was changing, rolling hills, dense forests, and small villages that seemed to stretch endlessly. The weather was still warm, but hints of autumn were beginning to appear in the crispness of the morning air. Our division was now part of the spearhead of Army Group Center, tasked with breaking through Soviet defenses and reaching the Dnieper River. The resistance had increased since the early days of the invasion. Soviet forces were putting up more organized opposition, though they were still no match for our panzers and tactics. On July 20th, we engaged a Soviet armored formation near the town of Orsha. The battle was more intense than anything we had encountered so far. The Soviets had deployed T-34 tanks, which were superior to our Panzer 38TS in armor and firepower. Their 76mm guns could penetrate our frontal armor at ranges where our 37mm guns were ineffective. We need to flank them. I yelled over the noise of the battle. Hit them from the sides. Our tank maneuvered through a field, trying to get a better angle on the Soviet tanks. The Bock engine roared as we accelerated, the tracks churning up the earth. Suddenly, a shell struck our front plate, sending a shockwave through the tank. Hit! Franz yelled, but it didn't penetrate. I breathed a sigh of relief. The T-34 shell had hit our frontal armor but failed to penetrate, thanks to our tank's angled design. Helmet quickly returned fire, his 37mm shell striking the T-34's turret. The Soviet tank stopped smoking, its crew likely killed or wounded. We destroyed 3 T-34s before the remaining Soviet tanks retreated. Our own losses were minimal. One tank was damaged but could be repaired. The crew was shaken but unharmed. After the battle, we examined the destroyed T-34s. These were impressive machines, well armored, with good guns, and powered by diesel engines that were less prone to fire than our gasoline engines. If the Soviets had more of these, our advantage might not be as great as we thought. That night, as we set up camp near Orsha, I received a letter from home. My parents wrote about how proud they were of me, how the war was going well for Germany, and how they hoped I would be home soon. The letter was a reminder of what we were fighting for, but it also underscored the distance between us and home. We had been on the move for nearly a month, and the thought of winter approaching made me wonder if I would see home again before the snow fell. By early August, we had reached Smolensk and were once again participating in a massive encirclement. The city was a key transportation hub, and its capture would open the road to Moscow. The Soviet forces defending it were putting up fierce resistance, but our panzers were too fast and too powerful for their outdated tactics. On August 5th, Smolensk fell to German forces. The encirclement was complete, trapping over 300,000 Soviet soldiers. The scale of the victory was staggering, yet another massive pocket of Soviet forces had been destroyed, with thousands of prisoners and vast amounts of equipment captured. Our division was now resting and refitting near Smolensk, preparing for the next phase of the advance toward Moscow. The mood was confident, almost euphoric. We had achieved stunning victories, and Moscow seemed within reach. But as we rested, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The weather was beginning to change. Mornings were crisp, evenings were cool, and the days were getting noticeably shorter. Winter was coming, and we were still hundreds of kilometers from Moscow. One afternoon, I was walking through a nearby village when I noticed something unusual. The local peasants were harvesting their crops with a frantic urgency that seemed out of place. When I asked our interpreter about it, he explained that they were trying to bring in as much of their harvest as possible before the winter came. Winter? I asked. It's only August. The interpreter looked at me with a mixture of pity and understanding. In Russia, winter comes early, he said, and it is harsh. The snow can be deep, the temperatures can drop to 40 degrees below zero. If you are not prepared, it can be deadly. His words sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cooling weather. We had planned to reach Moscow before winter, but the distance was still great, and the time was running out. If we didn't reach the city soon, we might be caught in the open when the snow came. That evening, I mentioned my concerns to our regiment commander. He acknowledged the problem but remained optimistic. "We will reach Moscow before winter," he said firmly. "The Führer has promised it, and we will deliver." I wanted to believe him, but the interpreter's words kept echoing in my mind. Russia was vast, and winter was coming. If we didn't reach Moscow soon, the consequences could be disastrous. By late August, we were advancing again, this time toward Vyazma, another key city on the road to Moscow. The landscape was becoming more forested, the roads narrower, and the resistance more determined. The Soviet forces were putting up a better fight, though they were still no match for our panzers and tactics. On September 6, we engaged a Soviet infantry division near the town of Yelnya. The battle was intense, with Soviet soldiers fighting with a desperation I hadn't seen before. They were using anti-tank rifles and Molotov cocktails with devastating effect, destroying several of our tanks before we could overwhelm them with superior firepower and maneuver. After the battle, we searched the battlefield and found the bodies of Soviet soldiers. They were young men, many no older than the teenagers I had seen in the villages back home. They were poorly equipped, with outdated rifles and inadequate uniforms, but they had fought with a ferocity that was impressive. One of our officers, a veteran of the Polish and French campaigns, shook his head as he looked at the carnage. "These Russians fight like animals," he said. "They don't know when to give up." I didn't respond. The image of those young soldiers, fighting and dying for their homeland, stayed with me. They were not subhumans, as our propaganda portrayed them. They were human beings, just like us, caught in a war they didn't want, but were fighting with all they had. That evening, as we set up camp near Yelnya, I received a letter from a friend who was fighting in North Africa. He wrote about the heat, the sand, and the different enemy they were facing there. His letter was a reminder that this was a global war, with fronts all over the world. It was hard to reconcile the image of my friend fighting in the desert heat with our own situation in the Russian forests, where autumn was already giving way to winter. As I lay in my sleeping bag that night, I thought about the war and what it meant. We had achieved stunning victories, but the cost was high, in lives, in equipment, in the simple humanity of all involved. The question of why we were fighting this war, and for what purpose, haunted me as I drifted off to sleep. By early October, we had reached Vyazma and were once again participating in a massive encirclement. The city fell on October 13th, trapping another 600,000 Soviet soldiers. The scale of the victory was staggering, yet another massive pocket of Soviet forces had been destroyed, with tens of thousands of prisoners and vast amounts of equipment captured. Our division was now positioned near Vyazma, preparing for the final push toward Moscow. The mood was still confident, though there was a growing awareness that time was running out. Winter was coming, and we were still hundreds of kilometers from the capital. One afternoon, I was walking through a nearby forest when I noticed something unusual. The leaves were changing color, not just to the usual reds and yellows, but to a deep brown that seemed premature. The air was crisp, and there was a hint of frost on the ground. Winter was coming early, and it was coming fast. That evening, our regiment commander gathered us for a briefing. "The Führer has ordered us to take Moscow before winter sets in," he announced. "We are to make one final push, to break through the Soviet defense and reach the city." He pointed to a map. "Our division is to advance along the main highway toward Myzhaysk. We need to link up with other units and encircle the Soviet forces defending Moscow. Intelligence indicates that the city is within reach." The mood was mixed. There was still confidence in our ability to achieve the objective, but there was also a growing awareness of the time constraints. Winter was coming, and we were not prepared for it. As we prepared to move out the next morning, I noticed something else unusual. The civilian population was evacuating in large numbers, moving eastward away from the front. They were loaded onto carts and wagons, carrying whatever possessions they could. The sight was a stark reminder of the human cost of this war. Millions of people were being displaced, their lives turned upside down by the advance of our armies. That day, as we advanced along the highway toward Myzaysk, the resistance increased significantly. Soviet forces were putting up determined resistance, using anti-tank guns and mines to slow our advance. The weather was also worsening. Rain was falling, turning the roads to mud and making progress difficult. By evening, we had only advanced a few kilometers. The going was slow, and the weather was getting worse. As we set up camp for the night, I couldn't shake a growing sense of foreboding. We were running out of time, and the road to Moscow was still long. By mid-October, the weather had turned decisively, rain had given way to sleet, and the roads were becoming impassable. Our panzers, which had moved so quickly across the open plains of Belarus and western Russia, were now bogged down in the mud. The advance toward Moscow had slowed to a crawl, and winter was coming fast. One afternoon, as we were trying to move our tanks along a muddy road, we encountered a Soviet convoy that had been caught in the same conditions. The result was a chaotic battle, with tanks maneuvering in the mud, firing at each other at close range. Our 37mm guns were largely ineffective against the thicker armor of the Soviet tanks, but we managed to destroy several of them by targeting their weaker sides and rear. After the battle, we searched the abandoned Soviet positions. The soldiers had left behind equipment, personal effects, and propaganda posters, depicting heroic Red Army soldiers defending Moscow. It was a stark contrast to our own situation. We were bogged down in the mud, running out of time, while the Soviets seemed to be preparing for a determined defense. That evening, as we set up camp in a muddy field near Myzaysk, I received a letter from home. My parents wrote about how the war news was becoming more cautious, how there were rumors of difficulties on the Eastern Front, and how they hoped I was safe. The letter was a reminder of the distance between us and home, and it underscored the growing uncertainty of our situation. The next morning, we were ordered to advance again, but the conditions were even worse. The sleet had turned to snow, and the roads were now impassable even for our tanks. We were forced to abandon our vehicles and continue on foot through snow that was already ankle-deep. The advance was grueling. We marched for hours, through snow and slush, our boots soaked through, our fingers numb with cold. The landscape was bleak, rolling hills covered in snow, sparse forests, and small villages that seemed to stretch endlessly. There was no sign of the enemy, but the silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of our boots in the snow and the occasional call of a distant bird. By evening, we had advanced only a few kilometers. We set up camp in a small forest, huddling around small fires for warmth. The temperature had dropped dramatically, and the snow was falling more heavily. We were not prepared for this. Our uniforms were designed for autumn weather, not the brutal cold of a Russian winter. As I sat by the fire, trying to warm my hands, I couldn't help but think of the letters from home. My parents had written about how proud they were of me, how the war was going well for Germany, and how they hoped I would be home soon. But the reality here was different. We were cold, tired, and running out of time. The road to Moscow was still long, and winter had arrived early. By late October, the situation had become critical. The snow was now knee-deep in places, and the temperature had dropped to 20 degrees below zero. Our advance had ground to a halt, and we were now in a defensive position, trying to hold the ground we had gained while the rest of the army regrouped. One afternoon, we received word that we were being reinforced with new equipment and supplies. When the supply train arrived, we were shocked by what we saw. There were not enough winter uniforms for everyone, and the supplies were inadequate for the conditions we were facing. The reality of our situation was becoming clear. We were not prepared for the Russian winter. That evening, our regiment commander gathered us for a briefing. "The Führer has decided to postpone the advance on Moscow until next spring," he announced. "We are to hold our positions and prepare for the winter." The mood was somber. We had come so close, only to be stopped by the weather. The dream of reaching Moscow before winter had died, and now we faced the prospect of a long, cold winter in the field. As we prepared to settle in for the winter, I couldn't help but think of the letters from home. My parents had written about how proud they were of me, how the war was going well for Germany, and how they hoped I would be home soon. But the reality here was different. We were cold, tired, and facing an uncertain future. The war that had seemed so straightforward in the summer was now becoming more complex, more difficult. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag, trying to stay warm, I thought about the war and what it meant. We had achieved stunning victories, but the cost was high, in lives, in equipment, in the simple humanity of all involved. The question of why we were fighting this war, and for what purpose, haunted me as I drifted off to sleep. The winter of 1941 to 1942 was the harshest I had ever experienced. The temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero, and the snow was so deep that we had to dig tunnels just to move between our positions. Our uniforms were inadequate for the conditions, and many of our men suffered from frostbite and exposure. One morning in December, we woke to find that our positions had been overrun by Soviet forces during the night. The attack was sudden and fierce, catching us completely by surprise. We fought back with whatever weapons we had, but the cold had rendered our tanks inoperable, and our rifles were often too frozen to fire properly. After hours of fighting, we managed to regain our positions, but the cost was high. Dozens of our men were killed or wounded, and many more were suffering from exposure. The Soviet forces had withdrawn, but the message was clear. They were not defeated, and they were prepared to fight back. That evening, as we tended to our wounded and tried to warm up, I received a letter from home. My parents wrote about how the war news was becoming more cautious, how there were rumors of difficulties in the Eastern Front, and how they hoped I was safe. The letter was a reminder of the distance between us and home, and it underscored the growing uncertainty of our situation. The next day, we received word that the Soviet forces had launched a major counteroffensive all along the front. The scale of the attack was staggering, and it was clear that the war had entered a new phase. We were no longer advancing, we were now fighting for our survival. As the winter wore on, the situation became increasingly desperate. Our supplies were running low, and the cold was taking a heavy toll on our men. Many were suffering from frostbite, exposure, and disease. The dream of reaching Moscow had died, and now we faced the prospect of a long, difficult struggle. By early 1942, the situation had stabilized somewhat. The Soviet winter offensive had run out of steam, and we were now in a defensive position, holding the ground we had gained. The worst of the winter was over, but the cold was still bitter, and the snow was still deep. One afternoon, I was walking through our positions when I noticed something unusual. The trees were beginning to bud, and there was a hint of spring in the air. After the brutal winter, the first signs of spring were a welcome sight. That evening, our regiment commander gathered us for a briefing. "The Führer has decided to resume the advance on Moscow next spring," he announced. "We are to hold our positions and prepare for the coming campaign." The mood was mixed. There was still confidence in our ability to achieve the objective, but there was also a growing awareness of the challenges we faced. The winter had taken a heavy toll, and we were not the same army that had invaded the Soviet Union the previous summer. As we prepared for the coming campaign, I couldn't help but think about what had happened. We had come so close to reaching Moscow, only to be stopped by the weather. The dream of a quick victory had died, and now we faced the prospect of a long, difficult struggle. But as I looked at the faces of my men, I saw determination. They had endured the brutal winter, and they were ready to fight on. The war was not over, and we would continue to fight as long as we had to. In the months that followed, the situation on the Eastern Front remained fluid. The spring turned the roads to mud, making any advance difficult. We spent most of our time in defensive positions, rebuilding our strength and preparing for the coming campaign. One afternoon in May, we received word that we were being transferred to a new sector, south of Moscow. The move was a relief. We had been in the same position for months, and a change of scenery was welcome. As we prepared to move out, I couldn't help but think about what lay ahead. The dream of reaching Moscow had died, but the war was not over. We would continue to fight, and we would continue to hope for victory. The road ahead was uncertain, but I was determined to see it through. We had come too far, fought too hard, to give up now. The war was not over, and we would continue to fight as long as we had to. As I look back now, from the perspective of decades, I can see the significance of what happened during Operation Barbarossa. The invasion was Hitler's biggest mistake, a gamble that failed because it underestimated the resilience of the Soviet people, the vastness of the Russian territory, and the brutality of the Russian winter. We had achieved stunning victories in the summer of 1941, capturing millions of prisoners and vast amounts of territory. But we had not destroyed the Red Army, and we had not reached Moscow before winter set in. The dream of a quick victory had died, and we faced the prospect of a long, difficult struggle. The cost was high, in lives, in equipment, in the simple humanity of all involved. Millions died on both sides, and the scars of the war would take generations to heal. But as I think of the men I served with, I remember their courage, their determination, and their humanity. They were not monsters. They were ordinary men caught in extraordinary circumstances, doing what they thought was right. The war changed all of us. It changed the course of history, and it changed the way we saw the world. We fought for Germany, for our families, for our future. And though we did not achieve all that we set out to do, we fought with honor and courage. As I look back now, I am proud of what we did, and I am grateful for the men I served with. They were the best of us, and they deserve to be remembered. The war is over, but the memory lives on. And as long as there are people who remember, the sacrifices we made will not have been in vain.